Hello. Let's take a moment and take a look at the transition we're undergoing right now, kind of look ahead a little ways to segment 2, and then take a few concluding comments related to segment 1. Just for a moment, segment 2, and then we'll get back into it here at some length. Segment 2 is our first characterization of the ZIN, the contextual end of our equation, the upstream, farthest most upstream part of the equation. We're going to characterize context by income inequality and think about the income inequality in terms of its implications on behavior and on health outcomes. We'll get to that in a second. Let's take another look at segment 1 for a moment, kind of concluding comments. There were two objectives in segment 1. One was to see how authors in the demographic literature characterize, describe, measure demographic outcomes of mortality and birth-related features like low birth weight. Demographic outcomes are often the measures of population health. So it's important to get our minds around how to do that. You're going to see them, population health, mortality, and low birth weight, all the way through the remainder of the course. So this is a way to kind of get an introduction to those measures. Now we use measures of mortality and birth because they're not complete registers of health. We can't look at morbidity. They're not complete. There are registers out there, cancer registers, but not everyone who has a particular kind of cancer is on that particular kind of registry. But here in the United States and in a lot of the Western world, shall we say, the vital registration system is virtually complete. In other words, everyone who's born, there's a certificate. Everyone who dies, there's a certificate. And those are part of the public record for people like you and I to do some analysis. So if we're looking at wanting to understand population health differentials across or between, say, two different populations, it's logical to go to the death certificates, even though, shall we say, it's after the fact. We get some good information about the population health, and when we look at it with this new model of social contextual, social determinant model, when we see the mortality in an area, we can look upstream and imagine and infer what kind of behaviors led to that, and beyond that, farther upstream, what kind of context led to those behaviors. So it works pretty well. So this is a practice to kind of get a sense, and I intentionally made these articles in that reading, or put old articles, 10, 15 years, 20-year-old articles. A couple reasons: because they're seminal. The authors of these articles are forerunners of people like you and I, who have been in the business for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and sort of seminal in their own approach to this, something that we can learn from on how to look at demographic events and analyze them. But because they're that old, and intentionally are they in the readings for this reason, very little did they explore the ZI. They're more interested in, when you look at that, you'll find more interest in characteristics of the individuals who gave birth, characteristics of the individuals who died, or the decedents. They don't go too far upstream. A lot of the XI in our equation for explaining the Y. So that's an interesting thing, because since we're a course and in recent times the interest is more upstream, or not so much more upstream, but adding upstream views to population health outcomes, it poses an interesting problem for us, and that is what we've been talking about, mining for gold. In these articles, can we find, even though they're 15, 20 years old, references, maybe specific intentional references to context as a way of explaining mortality outcomes? Or do we find them only sort of as, just in passing? So it's mining for gold. See what you can find in that. That is what the subject of your assignment 1 is about. Pick one of those readings, analyze it. What are they talking about? What's the thesis? How well does it fit with the theme that we have? Is there any gold in there? Any reference to ZI and to context? And that sort of thing. So the mining for gold is an important piece of this. And that would be the two objectives. One, getting familiar with demographic outcome measurements, and the other, realizing that in the early literature, demographic and population health literature, there was not much reference to context. Now, there are a couple of exceptions in those readings that are very boldly so. One is the article by Frisbee and his colleagues, and that's on intrauterine growth retardation. We'll call it IUGR. IUGR are babies who are born full term but low birth weight. And the thesis of that article is that the mothers are stressed, and because they're stressed physiologically, perhaps some of the energy that might have gone to the fetus doesn't go, and the baby doesn't grow to its full size by the time it is born. So that raises the issue, what's going on in the environment of the mother, the social environment of the mother. And the idea there is that where the social environment is stress, dysfunctional in some way, then the mother is stressed, and then that leads to the IUGR. A very interesting article, and you'll find in that Sociology of Health PowerPoint, I made reference to this before, some maps that I and some doctoral students at School of Public Health in Houston did. We mapped the locations of IUGR births in relation to socioeconomic characteristics of neighborhoods, and found where those neighborhoods were in distress, that was where the incident of IUGR was highest. So you can get a visual image with those maps of that. The other article that's an interesting article in there for a couple of reasons. One is it's by Geoffrey Rose, who is, I don't want to call him an old-timer, but very early in the literature of social determinant, as we've been calling it. We like the social influential perspective rather than the determinant, but in social determinant models, he's probably the forerunner of people like Marmot and Wilkinson. Really began thinking about this in the early days, and he has an interesting comparison in there when you read that article, which I'm sure you have. What's it called? Sick population, sick individuals, something like that. He makes a comparison between Kenyan nomads and British civil servants. Well, right there you can quickly imagine the differences in those contexts, right? Nomads roaming around doing what they do to make their lives, and then British civil servants coming into an office setting and sitting constrained in their environment. I think you'll see there that he talks about the systolic blood pressure, and they're very different when you look at it. He's got the diagrams there. The systolic blood pressure expresses the differential in the context differential of those two groups, the nomads and the civil servants. Pay attention to that. It's a very good introductory article. The other article in that segment leads into chapter 1, I think it is, or maybe the introduction, chapter 1. But the article in here, the chapter in here by Marmot and Brunner, it's either the first or second one. One of the things that we're wanting to establish as we get into this is that if the context is dysfunctional and then it creates stress on the individual, is there a physiological response? In other words, if there's stress, is the physiological response an impairment or a suppression of the autoimmune system that then makes that individual susceptible to illness, infectious, or perhaps even to chronic, the onset of chronic disease that leads to those health profiles and health outcomes that we are characterizing as our Y on the left-hand side of the equation. Brunner has an article in there. Read that closely. I've made reference to it in my notes, probably made reference to it in the last YouTube, and then pay attention to the article or the first chapter here. That's an essential piece of the argument. Without being able to establish that foundational piece of the physiological response, we have no connection from context to outcome. But I think when you read that, you'll see that Brunner will bring that connection to you. Okay, so we're concluding segment 1 and going into segment 2. Segment 2, whereas segment 1 we're kind of looking at downstream. We're downstream in the Y, looking upstream for any goal that we can see that might characterize that ZI contextual influences on the health outcomes described in those papers. Now we're more focused on the upstream ZI and be looking downstream as ZI. We look at variations of ZI context. Will we see variations in behavior and consequently variations farther downstream in our outcomes. Our first way of doing this, we're going to, if you've looked at the syllabus, we've got income inequality, and then we go to social cohesion, social capital, and then we go to social networks. And each one of those is going deeper and deeper and deeper into the social dynamic, the social fabric, if you will, of the production, of the social fabric that produces behaviors or influences behaviors that in turn influence health outcomes. But let's start with income inequality in that segment too. It's the one that we most logically would think about. You know, one of the reasons why people don't do so well is they don't have the income or they don't have the insurance. It's a very common conversation that we have in our country. Good conversation to have, actually. But so we can imagine if you've got money, you've got access to health. If you don't, you may not have access to health. And even if you have insurance, it may be that the healthcare system won't be so readily acceptable of insurance as they will with somebody that's got the money to put on the table. We're well aware of all of those kinds of dynamics. But we don't really, it's not really about income inequality. But what you're going to find when you read these articles, that when we thinking of regression analysis and statistics, and I don't want to get into that too much right now because I've got two sets of profs notes I'm working on yet for this segment 2 that look at articles, two main articles, and then in some detail all the articles, and we'll get into the more statistical presentation of the argument of these authors next week and the week that follows. But here in what we're looking at is generally when you control for income inequality or income differences, there are contextual differences that remain. And one of the ways that we think about income inequality when we're thinking about ZI, think about in those areas where income is most unequal, shall we say. Or let's say that we're thinking about neighborhoods in terms of social interaction, in terms of support to one another, associational behavior. You know, if I want to borrow an egg, do I feel comfortable knocking on somebody's door and borrow an egg? And they know that if they need me to, if they want to ask if I have a quart of oil in the garage they can use to change the oil. Everybody feels real comfortable with one another. There's interpersonal trust. It's not one of those kinds of neighborhoods sometimes you've been familiar with. You walk down and you get a little bit of a chill. The hair on the back of your neck stands up. There's a lot of associational behavior, maybe yard parties and different kinds of things that people do. A lot of things happening in the front yards and not in the backyards behind tall fences where maybe you can hear your neighbor but you can't see him. So interpersonal trust, associational behavior, and that sort of thing. It seems that in the literature that what they're making, the argument that they're making in the literature in segment 2, where income inequality is high, it's not so much about the income inequality, but it is the behavioral issues that are associated with that. That where income inequality is higher, there's not as much interpersonal trust. There's not as much associational behavior. There's a certain kind of dysfunction that begins to characterize a society or a neighborhood or a city or a state where those inequalities are very uneven or very disparate. I've got these Prof's Notes 1s that I've put out there that you can take a look at. I wanted to point out an article that you'll be looking at in here by Kennedy and all about the Robin Hood Index. Here, let me hold this up. You can see it here. The Robin Hood Index is exactly what it says. If we were to take, thinking about the unevenness of wealth, if we were to take wealth and more evenly distribute it, move wealth through legal means, right? Not like Robin Hood might have done it. But take wealth through taxation or something and more evenly smooth out the distribution of wealth. Would we find that we would have more interpersonal trust, more associational behavior? You'll see in the literature that in those countries where the inequality is less, where it's more evenly distributed, there's more trust, less interpersonal violence, and that sort of thing. In a country like ours, where it is more unequal, there seems to be less trust and perhaps even more interpersonal violence. What this is talking about, when you see this, let me turn here. Here on the x-axis, you have the Robin Hood Index. As you move to the right, it's how much of the wealth would need to be redistributed. So out here we've got 35% of the wealth would need to be redistributed. Here we've got on the y-axis, we've got most people can't be trusted. This is at the state level. So here you can see, since this line goes up, it's positively related. There's a positive relationship. In other words, as the amount of wealth to be redistributed increases, that is in need of being redistributed, the proportion of people who don't trust others goes up. So that in these areas where there is a need for 35% redistribution, there is a high 64-65% of people who have little trust of one another. These are the states. This is Texas right here, probably not surprising to us here in Texas, right? Here's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, New York is there, Kentucky. Some states that you might recognize as probable candidates for this corner of the graph. But this is an expression of where we're going. If we look at the income inequality, we discover in segment 2, it's not just about the income distribution, the unevenness of it. It's a consequence of that in terms of behavior and expectations of one another. That's the theme of segment 2, and that's the theme of the reading. And then you'll see as we move into segment 3 that then if it's not about income, it's about cohesion. So that in segment 2, where we find greater amounts of inequality, we find lower amounts of social cohesion. So as we move to segment 3, we'll look at social cohesion. And then when we look at social cohesion, we'll find where there are greater amounts of social cohesion, there's more dense social networks, which is the subject of segment 4. So where social cohesion is high, networking is high. So that's the logic as we move through the course, as we re-characterize with each segment and sort of dig deeper, shall we say, into the social fabric of those things in upstream ZI that lead to population health outcomes. So I guess that's it for now. The first paper is due on September the 26th, and I did that purposely. It's a week after the conclusion of segment 1. That gives you a chance to take a look at the video like this one and other videos I've done, the prof's notes I posted for segment 1, discussions in segment 1, to kind of help you frame how you want to write that paper, and gives you a weekend to segment 2 to post it. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you again. Y'all be careful out